Good evening, everyone. Whether you're online or in person, a very warm, quite literally warm welcome to this IOE professorial lecture by Nicola Walsh. I'm Professor Li Wei. I'm the Director and Dean of the IOE. I'm very pleased to be able to chair this session for you. Now, to introduce today's lecture, very interesting title, Arts, Nature and Wellbeing, Journeying Towards Sustainability for Children and Young People. Our speaker today is Nicola Walsh, who is Professor of Education at the IOE, as well as our Pro-Director Education. Her scholarly background is broad, including a degree in geography and geology and a PhD in glaciology. Now, she's going to explain that, I hope, to us. Then into education. She initially taught geography in secondary schools in the UK. From there, she moved into initial teacher education and leadership roles within the higher education sector at Cambridge, at Anglo-Ruskin universities, and also at the IOE here. Her education research has been predominantly in the field of geography education, with a focus on environmental and sustainability education, most recently through the pioneering Eco-Capacity project, which we will hear more about in the lecture today. Nicola has also been an important advocate and leader in this field through various prestigious research networks, including the European Education Research Association, but also through her founding of the UCL Center for Climate Change and Sustainability Education here at the IOE. Working in partnership with colleagues from across UCL and externally, the center will support teachers in educating the next generation for a climate-altered future. As IOE rounds up its 120th anniversary celebrations, this center is an important historical marker in the faculty's contributions to education and society. Nicola, on such a pressing matter for our education system and for our young people, I invite you to present your lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Li Wei. Thank you very much, everybody. It's really slightly terrifying, but also a real privilege to be here and in front of so many very close colleagues and friends and my family, of course, here as well. So thank you so much for coming. I really do appreciate it. And I feel like I wouldn't have been surprised if the room was actually half empty, but also very welcome to you as well who are watching me online. I really appreciate you taking the time to do so. As Li Wei very kindly introduced, the title of this presentation is Arts, Nature and Wellbeing, Journeying Towards Sustainability for Children and Young People. And if it's okay, what I'm going to do is really take a bit of a journey through my research career predominantly, but sort of other elements of it, picking out what I would identify as key moments of the development and shaping of my practice, particularly my research, but also my broader practice. And I'll sort of pepper in some of the key seminal publications throughout that to give you a sense of some of the research. But it's going to be sort of a bit of fun, catering to everybody in the room and at home, hopefully, and hopefully you'll enjoy it and obviously have the lovely refreshments at the end as well. So thank you for being here, and thank you for sort of listening to my presentation. What I want to do is start with a quote from some research that we undertook as part of the UCL Centre for Climate Change and Sustainability Education, which, as Li Wei said, launched last year, and I'll come back to it and talk about in a little bit more detail later on. And the quote you can see is from one of our 13-year-old students that we spoke to. We went and spoke to in depth. We did case study research at 10 schools around England to really understand the ecosystem around sustainability and environmental and sustainability education. And that included speaking to 102 children across these 10 schools in England as part of that. And one of the students said, as you can read, it can be a bit depressing. We need more positive stuff. We need to have hope. what we found when we undertook that research is that most children and young people really could, well, some children anyway, could start to articulate what the causes and impacts of climate change were. But the sort of overarching feeling in terms of emotions was fear, a sense of fear about what climate change would bring, but also hopelessness. So the sense of despair at the fact that we weren't doing much about it, particularly people in leadership positions. Now, I will come back to this, as I say, later on, but the reason I wanted to highlight it now is really for two reasons, and hopefully they will kind of appear as themes or threads throughout this presentation. First of all, the idea of hope, which the student there mentioned, and the idea of us as sort of educators, as research, making sure that whatever we do is supporting that element and aspect of hope rather than contributing to the sense of despair, the sense of climate anxiety, but also broader mental health and well-being concerns. So through education, we should be creating agency and empowering our children and young people. And that will be one theme, hopefully, that will be picked up throughout this presentation. The other thing is it's a quote from one of the children and young people that we were working with. And that is really important to me, the idea of listening to children and giving them agency and empowering them through our research as well as our practice as being really key to the work that I've done all the way from starting back 20 years ago when I started sort of undertaking bits of research and foregrounding that children's voice. And again, hopefully that will come as something that emerges as a theme throughout this presentation today. And I have to say, I consider it a real privilege to be able to work with and foreground those children's voices through the research that I undertake. They always teach me, from whatever background, whatever age, far more than I'm actually asking them. And I think that's really important to recognise. So, where we go back. Now, Lee Way has already signalled my PhD starting in glaciology. The first few slides, I have to say, are a bit self-indulgent here, so hopefully you'll bear with me. Going back to my geographical roots and starting to think about where this whole journey began. And for me, it began as I sort of moved towards the end of my A-levels. I was starting to think about what I might want to do, and I saw this article, and it talked about the Galloping Glacier. It's the Bering Glacier in Alaska, which flows, it's sort of the largest glacier system in North America. It flows into the Alaskan Bay in the south east of Alaska. And I saw about it, and it was surging, which means basically a glacier moves really, really quickly. It's all relative, but it's moving really quickly. And of course that's key because it means it's dumping lots of ice into the fields, and as the ice is dumped into the fields, it then melts. So it was really interesting, and it hit the headlines. And I thought, oh, that's quite interesting. I might see if I can go and see what's going on there in Alaska. So I wrote, and this made me reflect a little bit, I wrote a letter, and that, children, these are my children at the front, is something that you do with a pen and paper before email was invented. I wrote a letter to Professor Lingle in the Geophysical Institute, who was quoted in this article, to ask him if I could go and visit him. And he very kindly wrote back and said, yes, absolutely. And there is a picture of me having gone and visited him, spending the time in between my A-levels and my university to go and visit him. I went and visited the Geophysical Institute, which is this picture in the top left there, and you can see the picture. Now, I promise there's not lots of pictures of me in this presentation. There are actually 4, so you've already got 2 out of the way so far. That's me at age 18. The middle picture there is Professor Lingle's son, Eric, so that was me. But he really gave me a sense of glaciers and really inspired me. I was from then I was hooked in terms of interest in glaciation particularly. The other really key thing is the bottom left picture on there, because when I was going around Alaska, Professor Lingle pointed out buildings. This was in 1994. I'm giving my age away a bit here. But he pointed out buildings and was saying they're melting because of the permafrost is melting. Now, this was a time when I just finished A-levels. I hadn't done anything about climate change in A-level geography, hadn't really heard of it. Most people hadn't heard of it. And those people that had heard of it, of course, some people didn't believe it, the human-induced climate change. But for me, I think that really stuck in my brain. At the time, I didn't realise it, but it sort of planted a seed that something was happening to the climate that we were living in and that we needed to do something about it. So I was bitten by the glaciology bug. Picture number 3 of me in the middle there. I went on to do my degree. I went and chose to do a PhD, as Lee Way said, in glaciology, looking at ground-penetrating radar, GPR techniques for studying glacial meltwater or hydrological systems. So what I was doing was trying to use that radar, which is the picture on the left-hand side there. Very different from working with children, I can tell you, but basically those long black things are the radar antennae. You'd moved it 20 centimetres, it would beep a lot because it would be collecting data, and then you'd move it another 20 centimetres, and that was basically 5 or 6 weeks of an Arctic field season. Spent time in Iceland, spent time in Svalbard, hugely lucky. On the right there is a moulin. So a moulin is where the water goes from the surface of the glacier into the glacier, and hopefully you can see the very tiny person wearing red at the back to give you a sense of scale. So huge, huge water systems, and I was trying to understand how the water flowed through glaciers, because that impacts, again, how the glacier flows, how fast it's going to flow, and therefore how it's reacting to climate change. And these are the sorts of things I was producing and analysing. So I'm not going to go into much detail, but you can see where the arch is. At the centre of that would be a channel, and that's kind of a cross-section through the glacier. So that was what I was doing. But after the PhD, I didn't think academia was really for me. Clearly, I'm still thinking about whether I should need to change my mind about that, possibly right with geophysics. But what I did understand was that I loved learning about the world myself, and I really wanted to start to think about how I could teach other people about the world as well. So I trained to be a geography teacher, to work with children and young people. I loved the geography. I wanted to continue learning about that myself, but I also wanted to be able to inspire others. And again, this is where I'm sure my children are cringing, but to understand and appreciate the rich experiences that I was lucky enough to have and teach others about the world. So that's what I did. But of course, alongside that, I thought it'd be a good idea to do a master's in education, a real paradigm shift for me, because I'd gone from studying glaciers and doing geophysics to moving into a field where I was trying to understand how and why children were learning. And I thought, actually, I needed to kind of rethink the way I was thinking about research, basically. The whole ethics thing was a big wake-up call. I can tell you, you didn't need to do ethics when you were working with glaciers, although now I would argue you probably do. So when I was doing the master's, what I started to look at as part of my dissertation was looking at Year 8 students, so sort of 13-year-old students' understandings of sustainability in particular. So again, straight away, I was starting to think about how students are conceptualising something like sustainability as an abstract concept. And this here is one of my, in fact, the most cited paper. And I think the reason for that is, even though it's quite old now, is that it was the first time that we'd, as researchers, started to try and understand what children understood about sustainability. We've done stuff about students at higher education, but not actually within schools. And you can also see here, this is one of the data collection methods that I used, the concept map. So thinking about sustainable tourism, getting to understand how children conceptualise sustainable tourism and sustainability through a concept map. And this paper, I think, is key in two ways. First of all, it suggested or identified that when children were articulating their understanding of sustainability, they were really focusing on the environmental. And for those of you that don't know, we tend to, particularly at school level, articulate sustainability as having three pillars. So the environment, society, and the economy. And children were really quite good at articulating the environmental aspects, but not the society, the social justice bit, or the economy. That's been kind of borne out in repeated studies since then by me and others, but it's really shaped the way, at the time, it's shaped the way I was starting to think about my practice and the way that I would teach children about sustainability. The second key thing was it started to develop in me an understanding of how we elicited from children, as I said, their understandings of particular concepts, particularly abstract ones, particularly sustainability, and the fact that we needed to think more creatively using visual methods rather than just kind of traditional techniques. So that work, through that student voice and through that research, really started to inform kind of my first early years of teaching as a geography teacher. That, on the left hand there, is one of my Year 9 students at the time's understanding. This was actually a GA, Geographical Association project, Where Will I Live? Alan, the president of the GA, is very kindly here today, so thank you so much. But really the GA was instrumental in shaping some of my practice, and that dialogue I could have with other professionals through things like the teaching geography articles, which are there illustrated on the right-hand side, were really formative for me, and it really gave a rich community of practice in which I could try out and test new ideas, and I would be a strong advocate of subject associations ever since. But it started to help me unpick and really problematise some of the concepts, such as sustainability, with students in the classroom. Doesn't matter if they're year 7, they can still engage with and see the issues with some of these key concepts. So when I then had one of my, my first child, Kira, 16 years ago now, which is quite shocking, I had the opportunity, I was really lucky enough to move into the University of Cambridge to start to support their PGCE programme, encouraged by Mike Younger, some of you might know at the head of Faculty of Education at Cambridge, but also Liz Taylor. And I made the move into university, although I kind of kept a foot in both camps for some time. And this had a real impact as well, because previously I'd been working with just my own students, but moving into initial teacher education, I could start to shape some of the thinking of future geography teachers, which I found hugely rewarding, a really important job. And of course, it still is. And through my pro-director role now, I find that one of the key things and strengths of IOE is the way that it teaches and shapes new teachers, and early beginning teachers as well. So it gave me time to work with the students, it gave me time to develop my research, and it also gave me time to think about collaborations, which I wouldn't necessarily have had the opportunity to do through the research. So working with the PGCE team, for example, English, as in this example, I was able to develop some of the projects I was undertaking. One of the things that I found really interesting when I was starting to think about the pedagogies for supporting children's understandings of sustainability was the affective dimension. So we were starting to load on already then lots and lots of stuff or facts about sustainability and that kind of cognitive dimension, but we weren't thinking about the affective dimension, the importance of that. So I started at first to think about more arts or approaches to think about engaging students with that affective dimension. And the example here, I used poetry. So I was working with year 12 students to use poetry with them to, again, problematize that idea of sustainability and think about how we could then rethink, revisit, reconceptualize, reframe that idea. You can also see that picture. So this was one of the research methods that I was using. So again, complementing with things like interviews, particularly with the older students, but starting to think, well, maybe if we ask them to draw a picture, so what does a sustainable city look like? We can elicit more information about what their understanding of that city might be than if we just ask them. And that, again, was something in terms of the development of my methodological base. It started to make me, I think the other thing that's important to note about that, to start to think about the value of other disciplines for contributing to environmental sustainability education. So traditionally then, and still is, people think that that's something that we should focus on in science or in geography, of course, but starting to engage with other disciplines and bring those in to give different perspectives, whether it's the affective perspective in this idea, to that concept and help children's overall understanding. Now you can see this is 2016, and 2016 was a really important year in terms of shaping the way that my career had progressed since then for two reasons. First of all, I moved to Anglia Ruskin University. I'm delighted to have brilliant colleagues from there today. And that one of the reasons I moved, well, I became course leader of the BA Education Studies, Primary Education Studies, with my brilliant friend and colleague Jo. And through that, I was started to think about working with, and of course, my own children as well, developing practice and working with primary children. The second big moment for me in 2016 was meeting Ruth Sapsed in Cambridge Curiosity and Imagination, and the wonderful artists that work with her. And I've got Sally here as well, who thank you so much. I know others are watching, so hello, Kathleen in particular. So learning and working with those artists has really shaped the way and changed the way that I think about research, practice and sustainability and the way we approach that. So, and I'll come on to that in a little bit more detail. So what we did is, with those artists in particular, as a small CCORM funded project initially, was to start to work with the artists to understand their practice. So the artist practice, I'll show you a little bit of a video clip in a minute, is really focused on arts in nature practice. So it's undertaking arts which connect children to nature and has all sorts of benefits for those children, which I'll come on to in a minute. But we understood the first thing we did was work with, through talk and draw focus groups. So that picture there is one which was created by one of the artists as part of this focus group, trying to understand from them what they felt the impact of their practice was on children. What emerged from that, and the little red things are the children, by the way. So we asked them to talk about place, nature, and art, and then they've situated the children within that, which was just really lovely. It's always inspirational working with them. So this is an example. Children were always very much at the heart of the work, but it emerged that actually well-being was a really strong theme in terms of the impact of the work and the impact on children's well-being. And from that, the specific thing to note as well was it often tended to be the children who were most disenfranchised from schools as an environment who were benefiting most from it. So it was really important practice. From that, then, we developed and decided that actually we needed to try and understand that more. So how could we really dig deep into the practice of CCI and this arts and nature practice and understand the impact it was having on children and young people? And we developed the wonderful project, Eco Capabilities, it's got a difficult name leeway, but it's very close to my heart. This is sort of my first big funded project, funded by the AHRC, and you can see there the partners on the left-hand side, Cambridge Curiosity and Imagination, key project partner because we were working with them, and the artists started while I was at Anglia Ruskin University, finished when I came here to UCL a couple of years ago, and funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. Now, Eco Capabilities really emerged from a concern with three issues. First of all, an increasing concern about the mental health and well-being of children and young people. This was prior to the pandemic when we developed the proposal, and of course it's got worse since. So an increase in sort of serious diagnosed mental health illnesses in children and young people from 12% in 2017 to 17% in 2020, and increasing, and worse in areas of high disadvantage with high disadvantaged children. Second of all, a concern about children's increasing disconnect from the natural environment and nature. And 60% of children in England have reported being outside, playing outside less since the pandemic. And the number of children playing regularly outdoors in the UK has fallen by 90% in the last 40 years. And of course, thinking about elements such as green poverty, again, access to nature and outdoor spaces is significantly worse for children and young people from disadvantaged areas. And then the final kind of pillar of this three-pillar Venn diagram is arts, and a concern about the increasing marginalisation of the arts in curricula, and yet the really well understood, frankly, therapeutic benefits of art for children and young people, but also the importance of it as a cultural capital element for children as well. And of course, children with low socioeconomic status have less access to the arts as well. So really it's a double whammy or a triple whammy for children from disadvantaged areas. But bringing those three things together, we wanted to look at and try to think about whether arts and nature practice could begin to address them. And they're kind of all enveloped by the sustainability element. So we undertook 8 full days, the artists such as Sally, undertook 8 full days of artscaping or arts and nature practice with children in areas of high deprivation in East Anglia to really start to understand, if you embedded this practice over a couple of months, quite a long period of time, what the impact was on children's nature connectivity, their pro-sustainable behaviours, but also their mental health and well-being. Alongside that, we undertook quite a wide range of mostly qualitative methods. So we looked at, we had a kind of pre-post approach to workshopping with the children, but that was drawing children's children had to draw what they conceived as their happy place. We undertook walk and talk interviews with them where they took us around the school grounds and talked about how they felt, how safe they felt in different areas. We undertook participant observation, and we undertook focus groups at the end of each day with the artists and the teachers. So quite a lot. And what I thought, rather than sort of talking about it anymore myself, is that I'll hand over to some of the artists, the teachers and the children.
We get to go outside to do art. We normally make it about what we are inspired by, like all of us were inspired by bugs and birds.
It makes you feel closer to nature and you can also see new parts of it.
I was noticing how many different things there are to the world.
And it definitely made me think how lucky we are to have such a beautiful world.
We need nature because we can't survive without nature.
There is so much inspiration in working outdoors.
The children said it was wild, it wasn't like going into nature, it's like you are nature.
And I think that's physicality, being in nature is so important. It was like an invitation to think, an invitation to imagine.
By offering creative and art activities, it invites them to actually slow down and engage with nature.
The nature gives the materials, the palette, the inspiration, and then the freedom to create, to intervene in the environment.
So much more full of life, so much more confident in building friendships, not with the usual children they would play with, they're taking more risks.
He's taken on slightly more leadership roles as well, and that's also transferred into the classroom. He's sort of more confident. One child has shown better listening skills for definite because he's been so interested, being more engaged to write through doing the drawings and writing. But the artist really made them look really closely and they've discovered things that they didn't notice were there before.
It's been lovely to see those children who don't normally excel in so many different areas of the curriculum finally come out of their shells.
You need to do more stuff outside.
Okay, but when you're outside, there's lots of space and it's calm and it's really peaceful.
Yeah, it's peaceful.
Yeah.
Beyond the gates. I had one perspective on nature. I didn't really like it, but when you took us there, it gave me a different perspective on it, and now I really like it.
We didn't even need songs because the birds were singing for us.
That's my favourite ever quote. We didn't even need music because the birds were singing for us. Hopefully that gave you a bit of a sense of some of the impact of the work around the arts in nature work that we undertook as part of Eco Capabilities. Very briefly, and I'll just talk through some of this really quickly, and the sort of seminal paper on Eco Capabilities is illustrated there. We designed or elicited from children and from the voices of children that the Arts in Nature practice developed 8 eco capabilities, and you can see them listed there. Things like autonomy, so starting to give the children confidence, particularly those children, as I mentioned earlier, who are disenfranchised from school. Usually they were starting to engage through these activities, but the teachers then reported that was following through into the wider week and beyond, so not just confined to the Arts in Nature practice. Thinking about then that relationship with the human and the non-human world, so that included the relationship with each other, so the children started to learn, and this was really important because when we did this work it was just after the sort of latest COVID lockdown. So they had been separate, they'd come away from that school community and were starting to help build through these activities that community again. And also with the non-human world. So they were starting to develop, notice and then take care of some of the nature that they were working in and with. We found that we're starting to try and unpick what the process of this was, and you can see that it was starting to develop their confidence, self-esteem, agency, their calmness, so they were able to slow down much more rather than the usual kind of frenetic, let's get through every sort of learning objective that we've got to on this day, so it allowed them to calm down, and that really supported their well-being. And they reported, the children, that they were happier with their life, and they felt more optimistic about what the future holds for them as a result of working and being able to talk in these ways. The other thing I just wanted to do really quickly is show a couple of examples of the children's drawings. As I said, we asked them to draw their happy place before and after the practice, and here's just a few examples. One of the things that we're unpicking at the moment is in relation to that process and how it took place is the idea of nature visibilization. So there's a concept which is about plant blindness, and which is a bit of problematic because it's a bit ableist, but the idea that people don't notice the plants, and if you don't notice it, then it doesn't really contribute to, it can a little bit, but your well-being. Whereas through this practice, the children were started to notice it was making nature visible to them, which was then contributing to their well-being. And again, that's something that we're developing a paper on. So in terms of thinking about next steps, we then moved on to thinking about, well, what is the next step? We understand this practice is making a difference, but how do we sort of engage with systemic change to make sure that that is, or try and ensure that this is embedded within schools? And there was a call from a joint UKRI Research Council funding opportunity, which looked at how we can mobilise community assets to mitigate health inequalities. So they knew that there were projects like this which were proving that there were benefits from some of this sort of practice, not this, but all sorts of community activities, but they wanted to see how we could scale up that sort of practice, make it more sustainable using community assets. And we did that through what we called community artscapers. So starting to think about, can we use school volunteers, so that wider school community, to engage with and support some of this work within schools in a very different way, of course, from the artists. And we'll never say that we can replace those artists. The artists are really, really important. But is there a way and a sort of an approach that can support schools a little bit using some of those volunteers? We also wanted to set up sustainable partnerships. So we were thinking really about looking across the ecosystem and the health, education and social care ecosystem. So not just schools, but how can we get different components of that ecosystem to talk to each other? And rather than just putting in interventions at the end when there's an issue, how can we work across the sector to in a sort of preventative way? And we also wanted to provide toolkits for stakeholders. So we undertook a range of methodology. I've not got time to go through it all at the moment. Very happy to talk about it later over wine. But we started to think about, and we're analysing the data now. And these are just some of the very brief findings. So the community artscaper model is deemed acceptable and appropriate by over 95% of respondents. These are people working in schools. Through a Delphi study, we found this out, who have responsibility for children's mental health and well-being. Using the community artscaper model had a positive impact, even though it wasn't sort of long days, it was small groups going out with volunteers or teaching assistants actually, but it still impacted children's confidence, relationships, happiness, but also the adults. So actually it's not just the children that you're working with who you're sort of affecting the well-being of, it's those adults who are taking the time to stop and work with children in a different way as well. But it identified a need for more and better professional development for teachers and a greater attention to multi-agency working. And this is something that we're developing for a future bid. So trying to think about how we can again influence and affect systemic change to make this practice more sustainable and implementable across the ecosystem. I did just want to pepper in a couple of quotes. Obviously the children one is great. Being in nature, you're free to explore and have fun. You have no limits. And they always say it far better than I do. But also one of the head teachers we work with in this project. So it's made them think differently about mental health support and the fact that it doesn't always have to be something that's gone through referral processes, that relies on external agencies. So what we're doing is trying to shift the way people are thinking about this. So rather than sort of just trying to influence and tinker around the edges, change in the shift, and it's an ongoing piece of work, isn't it, Ruth? But we won't stop until we got there. And of course, the idea of that is thinking about hope. And it's thinking about hope for the way that our systems and the way that our schools are working and the way that our whole health ecosystem needs to be reformed and needs to work for our children and young people. So, kind of moved onto that project. What I'm going to do is for the final sort of section, keeping on the time, of this presentation is to think about the UCL Centre for Climate Change and Sustainability Education, in which, of course, these projects are deeply embedded. Yes, there is a focus on mental health and well-being, but that links very closely with ideas of climate anxiety and the close connection between nature connectivity and the improvements in children's mental health, but also the improvements in the way children start to value nature and look after it. When I look back at the time when I went to Alaska, I was shocked I hadn't heard of climate change. We're now, and I'm sure you're all in agreement, and that's why many of you are here, at a time of unequivocal human-caused climate change. So there's rapid changes in the atmosphere, in the ocean, in the biosphere, in the cryosphere, of course, the bits of ice. We're experiencing widespread adverse impacts on humankind, but also nature, our natural systems, with vulnerable communities who have often contributed least being most affected. And the problem is that high-quality climate change education just doesn't exist in England, anywhere I would argue, but certainly not in England. And this means that children and young people are not adequately prepared to face this climate crisis as we keep talking about it, and this heightens their anxiety and it kind of disempowers them, so they aren't able to have that sense of agency that they really need in order to be able to progress and develop and become the citizens who can face this in the future. So the idea of the UCL Climate Change Centre for Climate Change and Sustainability Education, which was co-founded with brilliant Alison here, who's sitting at the front, who will feature in a video in a minute, who I'm sure you'll be delighted, is to ensure that all children across England at first, but of course we're more ambitious than that and would say across the UK and beyond, receive that high quality climate change education that they need, and we'll do that by supporting schools and teachers in a variety of ways, including through our world-leading research. And as with the other video, I'm going to hand over to Alison and some wonderful colleagues from school to explain a little bit more.
This new centre is really setting out to tackle three problems. One is the obvious one, that we are facing one of the biggest challenges humanity has ever faced. The second is that because it's such a big challenge, young people are feeling anxious, angry and afraid, and we need to support them. The third reason is that teachers are telling us they just haven't had enough training in this area. And if we really want this to be embedded across all age groups and all subjects, teachers have got to have more support.
I'm very concerned about climate change because of the weather increasing. In Australia, there's more wildfires and forest fires and bushfires, which is damaging their wildlife.
I think it's my moral obligation to make sure that we do address the sustainability with all of our children, just because they are, I guess, they're not only the citizens of the future, but they're going to be our politicians, our teachers, and I think the more work we can do now to make sure the children are informed and hopefully they live their lives in a sustainable way.
Nature gives us air and oxygen. If there were no nature, no plants, we wouldn't be alive.
As a member of the senior leadership team, I believe it's extremely important for us to take this issue into consideration for our future. It's something that we know is going to be an ongoing issue, and it needs to be really embedded in terms of the work we do with our students in the broadest sense, at a curriculum level, at a pastoral level. I think it's just something that really needs to be in the forefront of our mind.
The support we offer for teachers will be tailored by age group and subject, will be free for teachers to access, will be reliable, informed by the whole academic community at UCL, and it will be research informed.
The value of it being UCL is, of course, it's so deeply research informed, both in terms of the content of the science, but also in terms of the really deep and careful thinking about how you might best address that with students in terms of the pedagogy, in terms of the curriculum work.
If there's free CPD, even better. And I know from a UCL point of view, it's a very trusted brand, and I would feel very comfortable kind of learning from UCL as an institution.
I think our students really do care about climate change. It was them who chose David Attenborough to be one of our house heroes. It's them who asked for us to have meat-free Mondays on our school menu. And it's them who are now attending Climate Change Club and wanting to find out more.
In Climate Change Club, we make posters about climate change, and we research about the carbon footprints and greenhouse gases.
One of the things that children do is they talk in assembly about the small subtle changes they can make to the day-to-day life here in the school, turning lights off, nagging their teacher about turning the interactive whiteboard off, but making sure that we are thinking about the environment.
Not everything has been discovered, so we've got to sort of see and keep everything safe. So we don't know if maybe an animal's in danger that we don't know about, so we do need to help them.
This is an issue that is relevant for history, for geography, for the creative arts, where young people can express their hopes and fears for the future.
With nature, it's like someone's there with you, like protecting you.
We know that by 2025, schools are going to be required to have a lot more infrastructure in terms of having a sustainability lead, in terms of having a climate action plan, and therefore we know that partnering with UCL going forward is going to be really helpful for us to be able to put that into place.
We should all be more sustainable to help the planet.
I don't know why I need to talk. I really should just hand over to all the children. But thank you so much to all those who were involved in that. And I have to say I'm really, really lucky to have had the support and obviously the brilliant Alison who co-founded the centre with me last year, but also the support of the IOE who've been incredibly supportive for us allowing us and supporting us financially to start the centre and the wider UCL. So what I thought I'd do is just talk a little bit about some of the research findings that we've undertaken in this first year, which will inform our professional development. I'll just do it very, very briefly, but I think you'll agree that we've achieved a huge amount in just a small amount of time, and it's really key, this work, in sort of allowing us to realise our ambition, which is very ambitious. So we undertook a range of research already with parents, students and teachers through a number of projects. The case study work that I already alluded to, where we looked at and worked with 10 schools, which again was led by Alison and Sarah, who is, I think, here somewhere, but also Lizzie did some work on that as well, thank you. But also then our survey, a really important survey of teachers, which had almost 1,000 responses, which Kate so ably led and is working on some of the results now, which will be launched shortly, so watch this space. But it gave us 3 clear messages. First of all, parents, and this is work from the Public First parent poll that we commissioned last year, and this is the first time, I think, that anyone's actually asked parents what they think about climate change and sustainability education. So they said climate change is more important to their children than any other issue that they talk to them about. And 72% believe that schools are the best place for their children to learn about climate change, which is good. Again, going back to the students, and of course we've talked about this a little bit, these negative emotions of things like they feel angry, they feel it's the biggest problem affecting their future, they don't think it gets talked about enough in schools, they talked about learning it from social media because they don't know where else to go, and of course that's very concerning. And these sorts of negative emotions are really consistent with the sort of climate change education that pushes the science, pushes the knowledge, but doesn't actually think more about those kind of spatial and temporally complex impacts of climate change and emotionally responsive pedagogy. So it's not thinking about that affective dimension. And of course that links back to some of my early research that I undertook at the beginning of my research career when I was still working in the classroom. So these expressions of fear are really a logical response, but it shows that we're not preparing properly our children and young people for the climate crisis and various futures. And then we worked with the teachers as well, and we heard from them that 70.5% told us that they were teaching themselves about climate change and sustainability education, and enable them to teach about and incorporate this into their teaching. Only 12.6% reported that climate change was included in their initial teacher education, so they weren't getting taught about it in practice, nor were they taught about it before they got into schools or alongside when they were being trained in schools. And some of them talked about things like it being a tick box, a one lesson thing, things where they sort of squeezed it in if they felt they had to, but they didn't really know how to engage with it. So these sorts of responses from all of these three different stakeholders are really important in shaping how we move forward with some of our programme of work, which I'll very quickly skate over. There's a huge amount, and then I'll come to talk a little bit more about the professional development in a bit more detail. So you can see here that there's a range of approaches that we're looking at, and this is kind of a mocked-up website that we're sort of envisaging to reflect and support people as a hub moving forward. So yes, the professional development, thinking about sustainability leadership. So when we talk about professional development, it's for all career stages, from initial teacher education all the way through to leaders who are going to have to implement, as you heard in the video, things like the Climate Action Plan in the future. Undertaking our research, of course, and continuing our world-leading research programme, but starting to develop networks both with partners, and that's really, really important. We're not saying that we're the only people that are going to solve this problem, but we absolutely must work with and continue to work with our very important partners, which we're hoping and developing all the time. International work. So we've already started to undertake international consultancy. We've recently completed, led by Lizzie, a project in Iraq, which was really interesting, involved a field visit. And we're doing the same and similar projects with India and Zimbabwe, and that's through a partnership with the British Council. So starting to think about influencing of policy and practice, not only within this country through the professional development, but also internationally, working with, learning from, because of course we don't have all the answers. Other contexts have really, really strong sustainable solutions and also education as well, and bringing that back to our context. So what I want to do is finish off by thinking about, in particular, the Teaching for Sustainable Futures project. We thought a lot about the title of that, and this is the Teaching for Sustainable Futures is the name of our teacher professional development programme. And the idea is that the element and the idea of hope comes through that, because it's not thinking about climate crisis, it's not thinking about the negative connotations, but it's thinking about what are the possible futures and how can we embed more hope into that. And I've got some notes here because Alison always articulates her predominant role is leading this. She's done a fantastic job. And so I sort of want to use her words and absolutely acknowledge them. So the idea is she talks about, and we talk about, the Teaching for Sustainable Futures will empower teachers to draw on their age, phase and subject expertise, whilst also supporting teachers to engage with climate change as a challenge which has political, economic, social and ethical complexities, as well as scientific realities. So going back to that work, I started when I was a sort of early PGCE tutor, and thinking about the importance of different disciplines is very much at the heart of some of this teacher professional development. It's thinking about the contribution that different teachers of different disciplines can make to climate change and sustainability education, to give that much more holistic understanding of sustainability and climate change, but also to provide agency and to empower children and young people. So examples given, and we've been working on two subjects this year, history and geography. But examples are how in history you can help young people understand how we reached this point of crisis and when the turning points in our journey towards the Anthropocene began. In maths, I don't know whether any of you have read the latest IPCC summary report. It's full of graphs. How do we help our children and young people to understand, interpret those graphs, but also could they go out and calculate how much energy the solar panels on their roof are generating, how much money is needed, and how many carbon emissions that's saving. Art lessons, of course, can allow students to depict a world that isn't seen through an anthropogenic perspective and explore sustainable art practices, and of course can contribute in so many other ways, as I hope I've shown you through Eco Capabilities project. And of course there's lots of different things you could say, whether it's through business studies and of course science and the traditional subjects as well. So it's very much taught through subject, and our geography and history programmes will be being launched in July alongside our survey report from our Big Teacher survey. So we've got really exciting and busy few months coming up before a great celebration event in July. And of course, many of you will be invited if you would like to come along. So in terms of what next, just before I finish, What is next for the centre? And of course, we want to extend Teaching for Sustainable Futures across the curriculum within 3 years. So we hope that within the next 3 years, we'll have professional development asynchronous at first, so teachers can access online for every single subject. And just this is really important, it's for every phase as well. So it's primary and secondary and every, as I said, every level of experience of teachers. So we want to launch a Beacon School programme. So that is a network of schools where you have hubs, and each of those sort of expert schools or hubs can work with a network of schools around them to really support and work together. As I mentioned, partnership is so important to us, and we have partners with the schools as well as people like subject associations. But we also appreciate and understand that schools need those partnerships as well. So building those Beacon School programmes and allowing schools to have networks which offer support, as well as sort of support from us, are really important. We also want to develop and improve to a high level or high quality portfolio of research, and that will include more surveys. Of course, the survey is really helpful for us. We haven't launched the first set of results from it yet, but it provides a really good baseline for where we are, and working alongside all sorts of other things sort of around the government strategy for climate change and sustainability education and lots of other activity, we can monitor the impact of some of our work over the next few years. But we can also expand and develop our wider portfolio of research, and that includes obviously things like my own that I alluded to earlier, building on eco-capabilities that work within the space of climate change and sustainability education but aren't directly related to the programme. Also continue national and international policy engagement work, and that's really important to us. It's really important that we think more broadly and are really ambitious in the way that we want to approach our work. And again, that will include national policy engagement but also international through some of our consultancy work that I've already alluded to. So I'm going to finish, as I started, nearly there, with a quote from a student. And I know it's been a bit of a whistle-stop tour all the way back from 1994 when I went to visit the Bering Glacier. And then since in the last 20 years, I've done a lot of work, but I feel very much like I'm still only at the beginning. There is a lot still to do, and I think colleagues working in my field will agree. So if I look and end with these words from the students, another student working with us through the Grand Challenges project, one of the ones students, the secondary school students that we undertook focus groups with, and their words, change, we can make it if we try. And I hope that it's become apparent through this presentation that children's voice, the words of children and children themselves really inspire all I do. It gives me the inspiration to carry on. It helps me to to have hope, their optimism, their passion, their commitment, and when we're working with them, their amazing quotes, as you've heard today. It's really very humbling. And I would argue really strongly that it's our responsibilities as educators to reciprocate that. They give us so much through hope, then we have to give them that hope as well. And I'm very hopeful that my work will continue to work towards developing education which provides agency, empowers young people, and gives them hope for a better future for all of our children and young people. And I very much look forward to continuing my journey with them, but also with the colleagues, the wonderful colleagues that I work with, many of whom are in the room or in the virtual room. Hello, so thank you. And without whom, frankly, I wouldn't be here. Thank you all for being part of my journey. The really astute people will have noticed that I've only had 3 pictures of me, and I said that before. So there is the last one. That's me at COP. I was there with the brilliant Kate in Sharm el-Sheikh last year. Really scary, amazing experience, and another part of the journey which I haven't had time to talk about today, but another one which I'll carry on, and through that sort of work we'll continue to engage with policy work, but that's definitely for another time. So thank you all for listening. I really very much appreciate it, and thank you for everything that you've done to support me along this very important journey. Goodbye.
Thank you very much, Nicola, for taking us through that exciting, wonderful, fascinating journey. You brought on board so many different stakeholders, students, teachers, parents, policymakers, and of course researchers, as well as different perspectives: science, health, well-being, arts, and education. I know this journey is continuing, as you say, because ultimately it is about future and it is about hope. And for that, we thank you. As is customary for these IOE professorial lectures, we now have a brief response. And today we're very lucky to have two respondents, Professor Michael Rice and Dr. Lizzie Rushton. Unfortunately, due to last-minute family emergency, Michael can't be with us in person today as planned, but he's kindly made a video recording of what he was going to say, and we're going to play that in a minute. Just to introduce Michael, he is Professor of Science Education here at the IOE. With a background in teaching and teacher education, he is an internationally renowned authority on science education. His expertise also spans theology, bioethics, and zoology. His influential contributions range across school curricula for human flourishing, the interface between science, theology, and the arts, which again is very relevant to today's lecture, and the teaching of sensitive and controversial topics, and how to engage young people in science and mathematics. His academic standing has been mirrored in his many leadership roles, including national and international bodies, and currently serving as president of the Association for Science Education. And Lizzie is the head of department where Nicola is also based, of curriculum, pedagogy and assessment, and research director of the Center for Climate Change and Sustainability Education. As we've been hearing, like Nicola, Lizzie is a former geography teacher and now teacher educator. Her research crosses a number of disciplines, geography, science education, and in a highly collaborative way with teachers as well as students. She is a co-founder of the Journal for Student Geographers and an active member of many different professional bodies, including the Royal Geographical Society. So we're going to hear Michael's recording first, and we'll have Lizzie's response in a minute.
Good evening, and thank you to Lee Wei for a very generous introduction. And as he said, I'm just really sorry that I'm not with you in person. What I'm going to do now is to start sharing my screen, bringing up a short PowerPoint, which I'll use for what I'd like to say. I was delighted when Nicola came to my department, Curriculum, Pedagogy and Assessment, as our new head of department, and very impressed when I heard that one of her skills was an ability to shoot polar bears, which seems to me in today's higher education management a near essential requirement for heads of department. I thought I'd just show my own doctoral animals, red deer, so it's a female, and this is a rather artificial family group because they don't normally occur like that with a daddy and a mummy and a baby, which is probably why the baby is looking towards the father, rather surprised that he's there. Now, I want to get straight into one of the core issues that Nicola was talking about, the future of our planet. Is it getting better or worse? Perhaps surprisingly, as you may or may not know, there's been rather a rash of very optimistic books in recent years, basically telling us all that things are getting better and better. This is possibly the best known of them. It's sold very, very, very widely. Factfulness, 10 Reasons We're Wrong About the World and Why Things Are Better Than You Think. There's the redoubtable Steven Pinker, who tends to have a rather narrow view of what science can contribute to the world, but is also convinced that everything is getting better. And what these sorts of books do is they provide pretty valid data on things like the number of murders, incidents of war, progress in education, health, poverty, pollution, and so on. Our World in Data is a rather good online source of this. So here's a very typical graph that you tend to see. So the horizontal axis shows time from 1820 to more or less now. The vertical axis shows the share of the population living in extreme poverty. And while one can define what's meant by extreme poverty, this is a pretty good definition, which isn't really to do with money, but to do with the quality of life. And as you can see, the proportion of the world living in extreme poverty has indeed been going down. Counter to these rather optimistic views of how things are going, there are an increasing number of centres looking at what's often termed existential risk. So the University of Cambridge has one. There's the Future of Life Institute, which is a non-profit organisation. There's one at the University of Oxford, and there are others. Stanford, for example. And the importance of these questions about risk and the world's future is beginning to percolate through to applied philosophy. So this is a rather good recent book that I was recommended to read and have indeed read, What We Owe the Future. You will be very familiar, I suspect all of you, with graphs like this, which just shows temperature changes in the last 50 years. So that's from a baseline of only about the mid-60s or so, not long ago at all, and shows that things are getting warmer, particularly towards the poles, particularly the North Pole. I wanted now just to put that in the context, thinking of what Nicola had said, of tipping points and catastrophes. This is an example of a tipping point in action. It shows land which until recently looked as solid as any ground could look, but because of rising temperatures in the tundra, the permafrost, which has existed for many thousands, tens of thousands of years, is no longer permanent. And what happens then is you can get collapse, massive erosion, and as you can imagine, even if the global temperature cooled again back to what it was 100 years ago, it would take many, many, many centuries, possibly longer, to get back to the original state, hence a tipping point. I've been around long enough to know that when I was at school in the 1970s, it was genuinely fairly unsure whether we were going to enter a phase of global warming or global cooling. Reasons for global cooling were twofold. First of all, although people were aware of rising carbon dioxide levels in particular, quite apart from other greenhouse gases, and the significance this had for global temperatures, there was also a cooling effect of what you might call dirty air, and it was genuinely unsure whether that might outweigh the warming effect of carbon dioxide. And then longer term, there was the fact that we were an interglacial, which had lasted an unusually long time and should be coming to an end soon. Now, in terms of catastrophes, I just wanted to mention one of the most famous ones, the K2 extinction, almost certainly an asteroid impact 65.5 million years ago, well known because it led to a huge crater in, roughly speaking, the Gulf of Mexico now. And we think 3/4 of the world's species went extinct, including all non-avian dinosaurs. We're not at that sort of catastrophe yet. What we're at is a stage, and this all relates to global climate change, of course, where things are just getting worse and worse. And I'm afraid the rate at which they're getting worse and worse is accelerating, with a current extinction rate of about 1,000 times. But we haven't passed many tipping points yet. Whether we do or not depends on actions in the future. And I hope it's okay to say, but I thought I'd just mention that my father's family, like many secular Jewish families, found themselves in Germany in 1933 when Hitler came to power, and they were a well-off family. And my grandfather was a very successful businessman. So he reacted in a way he was able to. He was good at making decisions, and the family had the money, just by saying, "We're off." And they left within months. he and my father initially, and then my father's mother and the other two children a few months later, and there was a relative in the UK. The point of this is about how people deal with what looks to be extremely bad news. Most people, of course, are not in a position, for a range of reasons, to act so decisively, and humanity at the moment is not acting decisively with threats to biodiversity and global climate change. On a slightly more optimistic note, you can have positive tipping points. This was a recent BBC headline, 24th of March 2023. Leading lawyers say they will refuse to prosecute climate protesters or represent new fossil fuel projects. I don't want to make too much of this particular example. You tend to get these sorts of relatively modest actions, and then sometimes they escalate and bring about real change, and sometimes they don't. I only wanted to make one more point in my response to what I've seen of Nicola's lecture, because she kindly sent me her PowerPoint slide a couple of weeks ago. But she, of course, had a welcome emphasis on the role of the arts. And I'm a particularly keen film goer. And I remember Hitchcock's The Birds, as it's often called, but the book was originally written by Daphne du Maurier. And the arts have had a long history of predicting environmental crises. Daphne du Maurier's book came out a decade before Rachel Carson's famous Silent Spring. So good for Nicola on the work she's doing with her centre. Good for the arts and their contribution. And I've been very honoured to be here with you this evening. Thank you very much indeed. Good night.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Lee Wei, for your kind introduction, and my thanks to everyone who's made this evening such a lovely occasion. Thank you, Nicola, for inviting me to respond to your inaugural lecture. As a fellow geographer and educator, and as a colleague and collaborator, it's a privilege to say a few words, I hope, on behalf of everyone gathered here today and online, who I know represent only a fraction of the many professional lives that you've touched over the last 20 years. Our Department of Curriculum, Pedagogy and Assessment are hugely proud that CPA is both your home department and the home of the Centre for Climate Change and Sustainability Education. When reflecting on your presentation of your career so far, there are 3 themes or ideas which I'd like to touch on briefly. Firstly, that your work places such value on children's lives and experiences. They are shown through your work and career as being precious and important, not because they are our inheritance or our planet's future, but because they inherently matter. As you have shared through your early and innovative work, which shared children's conceptualizations of sustainability, children have knowledge, insight, and understanding that help us all make sense of the complexity and diversity of our world and our relationships with different species in different places and at different times. From the beginning of your work in schools and across the arts and nature and wellbeing and through your leadership of our centre, we can see this threaded through your work as if it were a strata, if you'll allow me. Your work is about intentionally and authentically ensuring that every child has an education which equips them for meaningful, healthy and happy lives. This work is and continues to be incredibly important and continues nationally and internationally through your leadership. Secondly, I'd like to reflect on the ways in which your work is rooted in the discipline and practice of geography. The emphasis your work places on building and sustaining diverse partnerships and collaborations with artists, schools, NGOs, policymakers, and academics from a range of fields is one example of this. Another is the ease with which your work and thinking moves across different spatial contexts and your work's nuanced and careful understanding of space and scale. For me, this speaks of a geographer who can draw together expertise and experiences from different contexts, and through this develop new ways of understanding complex problems such as climate change and sustainability education. This ability to value the hyperlocal, but at the same time speak to and respond to the global, is demonstrated through your eco-capabilities work and subsequent projects. Thirdly, and perhaps a little redundantly for this audience, I want to acknowledge how your work and leadership in this field continues to make a vital argument. for the value of education as an essential part of the way we as a global community seek to live justly on our finite and precious planet Earth. For educators, teachers, practitioners and policymakers, the value of education is something which perhaps we take, if not for granted, but as a given. We see every day how access to high quality education reduces inequalities and enables human flourishing. However, we as a community have to intensify our efforts and commitment to demonstrating the power of education in its fullest sense, especially in the context of environmental crises. Your teaching, research, leadership and policy work provide so many examples of what is and can be possible in this space when there are sustained and supported opportunities to work in partnership and to work in and with nature. So 3 invaluable strands or strata: the value and importance of children and young people, your rootedness in the discipline of geography, and the ways your work continues to underline the vital role of education in responding to the climate crisis and issues of equity and justice. I know I speak for all of us when I wish you a huge congratulations on everything you've achieved, and I know the best is yet to come.
Thank you, Lizzie. Thank you. And of course, thank you to Michael for his comments as well. And thank you for your comments, Lizzie. And thank you again, Nicola, for the wonderful, really stimulating and positive and hopeful talk. And also your wider contribution supporting educators in relation to environmental education. Thank you all for coming. That I'm afraid marks the end of our proceeding today. We have to say goodbye to those people online. Very special thanks for coming, the family. I hope the children have learned something about what your mother does during the day or when she's away from home. And thank you also to all the friends and supporters of Nicola's work over the years, and really appreciate your presence. For those in the room, please continue the conversation over a drink. Thank you very much for being here. Good evening.